Hey everyone, as promised, today I wanted to just chat with you about the pros and cons of marriage, what I call the kudzu of marriage. A lot of people come into marriage with assumptions about how it's going to work, how's it going to look, and a good number of my couples, when they come into my office, they talk about how they've grown apart, that they're like roommates, and um, a lot of distance has happened between them. Typically, how I refer to this is that there's this element, this creep that happens within any relationship, and that is closeness. And I've talked about this in another video that you can access on my website. This closeness, or this kudzu of marriage, creeps in and is a vital part of relationshiping. This closeness has uh, elements such as a desire for low anxiety, low risk. It ends up being about low spontaneity, comfort, familiarity. These are all aspects of that closeness, or that kudzu of marriage, and it just creeps in. Conversely, we have intimacy, and again, I've talked about that as being about high anxiety, high risk, high spontaneity, newness, novelty. And when that closeness creeps in, it begins to surround intimacy and push it out. So ultimately you have this sense of that we're just roommates, and the couple begin to feel like they're drifting apart. Well, in the extreme, that can look like sexless relationships, or relationships where there's hardly any sex at all. So when I have a couple come in, I will often ask them about how often are they having sex. And many couples report that they're not having sex at all, maybe haven't had sex in years. Then I ask them, well, are you monogamous? And their answer is usually yes, they are monogamous. And so then I follow that up with, well, what is the definition of monogamy? And they land on the definition as sex with one person. Well, then, if you're not having sex, you can't have monogamy. If you're not having sex, you can't have monogamy. And I'm broadly defining sex, of course, not just penetration. So if you're not having sex, you can't have monogamy, then you don't have a monogamous relationship. You have something else. I don't know what that something else is, but it isn't monogamy. So couples rarely ever talk about that definition. They rarely ever talk about what does it mean to be monogamous, and what are the implications of that. So that's one of the things that I'm hoping that we get to chat about today, is that definition of monogamy, and what are the pros and cons of monogamy. So when a couple decides to be monogamous, essentially what they're agreeing to is to be responsible and obligated to the other person sexually. Now, I know that that is very unpopular, but I add, or an unpopular sentiment, because I also add that the person must retain the right to say no to sex. So you have this binary, you have this responsibility and obligation for sex, but you also have to have and reserve the right to say no. Saying no, though, within a monogamous relationship can have a tax that is much higher because the agreement doesn't allow the other partner to seek out sexual gratification outside of the relationship. So anger and resentment, bitterness, all of these things can begin to develop over time. So there are the costs of monogamy in that you are saying, I have a responsibility, meaning I have to hold the ability to respond to your sexual needs. I'm obligated in that if I don't want you to have sex with anyone else, then I am obligated to have sex with you while also reserving the right to say no. If we're going to agree on this monogamy being the institution that's going to govern some of the behaviors within the relationship. So for some couples, though, monogamy isn't the only option. For a number of couples, there may be situations that necessitate considering other forms of relationshiping. And I guess I'm glad to say that more and more these alternatives are seen as just as legitimate. So for example, we have polyamory, and polyamory is just this recognition that some people can love many people at the same time. And they may be interested in living with others in order to grow deeper bonds. These kind of configurations can look like two women with one man, or a quad relationship, such as a foursome, groups of various sizes. The underlying notion there is that there's this sense of love, a sense of bonding that can happen with these other people. Certainly swinging is another option. A lot of couples find that when they open the relationship, there's almost a greater degree of intimacy that develops within their own partnership because they are opening that relationship. So some swingers are in committed relationships and go to swinging parties to find singles or other couples to play with. Now, there are of course risks associated with opening a marriage, or opening any kind of relationship. For example, jealousy might develop, where one partner is afraid that another partner's affection might go into the direction of someone else. For some people, it may trigger a sense of instability. Again, this feeling of, I don't know if I can rely on that partner in a way that I became accustomed to. Now, some people would say, well, what about the incidences of STDs or STIs? And on a logical level, you think, oh, well, these people are more likely or more at risk of contracting an STD. However, the literature suggests that, in fact, they are no more likely than those in monogamous relationships, primarily because people who may engage in ethical non-monogamy or some kind of form thereof are more inclined to use barriers to protect themselves from STDs, where people in monogamous relationships or presumed monogamous relationships are less likely. So that somehow has that balancing out effect. Of course, any relationship has its pros and cons. Any kind of governance, if you will, around a relationship has its pros and cons. Certainly, though, in the context of today's message, it's that monogamy often is touted as the gold standard, as the preferred way to have a relationship, and that there are only positives associated with it. And as a couples therapist and sex therapist, I've seen firsthand that that is certainly not a guarantee, that there are limitations to monogamy, particularly when there is little discussion between the individuals about what does monogamy mean? What does that governing institution, what effects does that governing institution have on our behaviors? If I am saying that I'm monogamous to you, then that sets up a contract that I will lean towards responding to your sexual needs as a means to ensure that your needs are being taken care of, so that you don't have to feel like you have to go somewhere else to get those needs met. And in an open relationship, if a partner doesn't want to have sex with their partner, then the other can get that elsewhere, and so it decreases that tension there, that possibility for resentment and frustration. So I hope that in this time today you had a chance to just question some of your assumptions around monogamy, around open relationships. Certainly that they both have pros and cons to be considered when choosing any kind of governing institution for your relationship. So before I wrap up, I want to give a little shout out that the Carolina Sexual Wellness Center is hosting an event on May 1st, 2018 from 7 to 9 in Cary, North Carolina. And that event is going to be held at the Page Walker Arts and History Center. That's at 119 Ambassador Loop, Cary, North Carolina. You can RSVP this free event by emailing info@carolinaswc.org. Until next time, go in peace and not in pieces. Bye-bye.